3 official whole life order prisoners from 2025 so far, with 7 murders between them, and 2 unofficial whole life order prisoners. You'll see what I mean. Enjoy. Direece Roche, who was born in June 1994, committed his first murder at the age of 16 in 2011. He and his brother Owen went round to the home of Adam Steele in Salford in Manchester, northwest England. The occasion was New Year's Day. They went round to try to find Owen's girlfriend. There'd been some struggles and tensions between Owen and his girlfriend, and when the brothers turned up to Adam Steele's flat, they demanded to know where the girl or woman was at. That caused an argument that erupted into the street, and Direece Roche, for whatever reason, got out a knife and stabbed Adam Steele to death with it. Now viewer, if I've got you hooked on the video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready, and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. For that murder, Roche got a life sentence with a minimum of 12 years. His brother, meanwhile, got an indeterminate sentence for manslaughter. 8 years after Roche was sent down, his legal team tried to get him out early. They said he was a reformed character, he had an excellent prison record, and he had raised money for charity. He had cut ties with all his criminal friends, and he was planning on enrolling for a psychology degree. There's no doubt that the judges were very impressed with the progress that Roche had made in prison, but they ultimately refused him early release because they just weren't convinced that he was fully reformed, fully rehabilitated. And we can see now that their scepticism was fully justified. For instance, on day release from HMP Kirkham in Lancashire in May 2023, Roche was found with a lock knife in his bag. He denied knowing anything about it, but in any case, he was released from prison that same year, September 2023. So off Roche went out of prison. Freedom was his again, although he is on licence, or rather was on licence forever, because when you get a life sentence, which you always get for murder, you do whatever your minimum term is, and then when you get out, you're on licence for the rest of your life, which means that you have to live by a strict set of rules, and if you break any of those rules, you can be sent back to prison for any length of time. Knowing that he had his licence hanging over him for the rest of his life, 9 months later, Roche went and murdered his great uncle, Fintan McDwyer. A father and a grandfather, Fintan McDwyer was 64. He lost his wife back in 2005. By the time of his murder, he was retired, and one of his favourite hobbies was taking his beloved dog Sammy for daily walks in his local park. When Direece Roche was little, he knew his great uncle. They would see each other regularly enough, but as Roche got older, his uncle, for whatever reason, fell out of his life. And another important point about Roche is that 3 years before he murdered Adam Steele, which, sorry for not saying this earlier, he did in 2011, he lost his mother. Her name was Samantha Toohey, and she committed suicide in 2008. In the note that she left behind, she said that when she was little, she was essayed by one of her uncles. Fintan McDwyer was one of her uncles, but the fact is, Samantha had 12 other uncles, and she didn't say which one it was, if it was any. Sorry, maybe she was essayed, maybe she wasn't. I personally don't know. So there was no evidence that it was Fintan McDwyer, and after Fintan's murder, the police looked into whether it could have been him, and they couldn't find any evidence to say that it was. So now we're all probably wondering, did Roche believe that that particular great uncle of his, Fintan McDwyer, was the one who had essayed his mother? And if so, was that why he decided to kill his great uncle? Just before killing his great uncle, Roche actually went to visit his mother's grave. She is buried in Southern Cemetery in Chorlton, and then just a few hours after murdering his great uncle, he went back to her grave again. On the day that Roche murdered his great uncle Fintan was home alone, except for his dog Sammy. His son Ryan, you see, had gone away to a wedding with his girlfriend. Late at night on the 29th of June 2024, Roche put on a balaclava and other dark clothing. He left his home in Longsight and went on foot to the home of his great uncle. He went through people's gardens, and when he got to his great uncle's home, he tried to open a ground floor window to get in. He wasn't able to do so, but then he found a ladder in a nearby garden and he used it to climb up to his uncle's bedroom window, and he got in that way. And then in a matter of about 90 seconds, he stabbed his great uncle to death, and he stabbed him 77 times. Finton's body was only discovered 2 days later when his son Ryan came home. Police arrested Roche in his home on the 6th of July. It was easy for them to find him because they found DNA on objects that were left near the home of Finton McDwyer, including some blood that was smeared on a fence, because remember, he'd got into his great uncle's home by climbing through gardens of neighbouring houses. And remember, because Roche is a convicted murderer with a criminal record, his DNA was in the police database. In his police interviews, he told them that he himself, as a child, had been essayed by his great uncle Finton McDwyer. It turns out, though, that that was the first time he had ever mentioned the matter to anybody. And he said that the reason for that was because beforehand he was too scared to talk about it. Roche also claimed that his great uncle had told him that his dog Sammy was named after his mother, Samantha Toohey. He said that that link disturbed him and that he decided that he had to steal the dog. Somehow that would stop the idea of the dog being named after his mother disturbing him. And we're all thinking, oh, you went to steal a dog, so you took a great big knife with you. Don't know how big the knife is, but you get the point. But the thing is, Roche denied that he actually owned the knife. He denied he'd carried it with him. He said rather that the knife was his great uncle's and that he had had to wrestle it away from his great uncle. That obviously implies that his great uncle was the one who attacked him. Funnily enough, the court didn't quite believe him, especially considering that Roche had stabbed his uncle 77 times. That is not self-defense. That's a furious, frenzied, ferocious act of murder. On the 19th of September 2025, he was told that he would spend the rest of his life in prison because he was given a whole life order. On Christmas Eve 1998, at the age of 19, Stephen Sansom got into a minicab, got to his destination, then got out the 12cm kitchen knife that he had brought with him and plunged it so far into the neck of the driver, whose name I couldn't trace, sorry, that it reached the bone of the man's cervical spine. This was the fatal wound of all the wounds that Sansom inflicted on his victim, including ones to the man's ear, throat and shoulder, plus the defensive wounds that the man sustained to his hands. Having left the scene, Sansom then returned to the vehicle and cut the cable to the radio microphone to ensure that the dying man couldn't call for help. And this was all for the 25 quid that the perpetrator had found in the driver's wallet, which he had stolen. Sansom was released on licence in December 2019 after serving more than 20 years for both murder and robbery, having pleaded guilty to both charges. Sansom had briefly dated 38-year-old Sarah Mayhew, who was mother to a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, years before he and Gemma Watts took her life. Sarah is how Sansom met Watts. She introduced the two to one another in the summer of 2023 and the two started hooking up. Sansom and Watts were from Croydon, South London. At the point when Watts started suggesting that she and Sansom should take their shared love of BDSM, a mutual trait that each had discovered in the other early on, to the level of killing a woman and then having sex together with Sansom covered in the woman's blood, for instance, Watts knew that Sansom was out on licence for murder and that he had, as such, the capacity to fulfil her fantasy. Sansom's WhatsApp message to Watts from the 11th of September 2023, which said, quote, "Everything looks like meat now, don't they? A plaything, something to cut, something to bleed. They all look different now," unquote, leaves us in no doubt as to his own enthusiasm for this idea, he and Watts subsequently discussing cannibalising their victim and suggesting how the person would taste. Sansom assured Watts that nothing was off limits for him, but I should say at this point that there is no evidence that either Sansom or Watts actually did cannibalise Sarah. After all Sarah's body parts were found spread all over South London, so In the sentencing hearing, the judge stressed that the WhatsApp messages make it clear that Sansom and Watts were equally complicit in what became their real-life plan of murder. It wasn't a case of one party's will being overborne by the other. It's noteworthy that in the process of identifying potential victims for their up murder plan, Watts stated of one particular candidate that she knew that Sansom could do no more than to have sex with her. He wasn't allowed to murder her. While Sansom had said earlier that absolutely anything was on, Watts, in contrast, had limits clearly to her sadomasochistic indulgences and clearly had the expectation that Sansom would respect her limits. The thing is, when the two eventually settled on Sarah Mayhew as their target, Watts didn't set any limits for their acts against her. Quite on the contrary. By November 2023, Watts was anticipating getting Sarah into Sansom's flat and cutting her throat. When Sansom replied that he would try to get Sarah to come round if she, Watts that is, wanted him to, Watts answered, quote, "Only if it's a deal that she's not leaving in one piece," unquote. In the conversation that followed, Sansom told Watts that he could slit Sarah's throat over her face. The conversation after that turned to whether Sansom had the tools, to which Watts replied, quote, "Great minds think alike," unquote. While it took a lot of coaxing from Sansom to get Sarah to stop by, when Sarah finally agreed, her visit coming on the 8th of March 2024, she was expecting a night of sex. She was never seen again. When the following day, 9th of March, Watts greeted a neighbour of hers after taking her dog for a walk, she showed no signs of nervousness or worry. Neither did Sansom, this same neighbour, a witness, describing Sansom's mood on that day as chirpy. The day after that, 10th of March, Sansom got busy on Sarah's body with the hacksaw and the other tools that he had bought that very morning, and soon enough, Sarah's body was sitting in a set of bags and in a suitcase awaiting removal. Having murdered Sarah 2 days before, you see, Sansom and Watts were only preparing to get rid of her body now. They kept it in their flat for 2 whole days. Anyway. Between April and May 2024, Sarah's body parts began turning up in areas of South London, Roden and Mitcham, both being very close to Croydon, where Watts and Sansom were living, being the main 2 places that Sarah's killers used as dumping sites. Other than taking Sarah's life, what Watts and Sansom did to Sarah just isn't known. Neither Sansom nor Watts would say, and with the decomposition and dismemberment of the body, the pathologist couldn't trace the harm inflicted on Sarah. At the sentencing hearing, where Watts got her 30-year minimum term and where Sansom got his sentence, whose details you know, a whole life order to be exact, the judge condemned the 2 killers' lack of remorse, citing words from a letter from Watts to Sansom saying, quote, "Love lasts, my evil twin," unquote. Another 2 savage animals. 3.3 million quid. That's the estimated amount that triple murderer and triple whole life order prisoner, 26-year-old Kyle Clifford, is expected to cost the taxpayer over the next 60 years. At the time of this recording, this makes the most expensive prisoner in the UK. Clifford's failed suicide attempt, which he made just moments before his arrest in July 2024 for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, her mother and her sister, and which left him paralysed from the chest down, means for a start that in prison, where he will be for the rest of his up life, he will need a specially adapted cell to accommodate his wheelchair. There will be the cost of the employees that will be taking him to the toilet and washing him, the cost of the nurses, the doctors, the physiotherapists and the occupational therapists that he will need as well. As regards nurses, they will probably be the ones to be taking the killer from day to day for a shit and scrubbing him clean. Instead of costing the taxpayer the already pretty shocking £55,000 a year that the average prisoner costs, Clifford, who caused his physical disability, as I say, by shooting himself with the same crossbow that he used to commit 2 of his 3 brutal murders, is set to cost at least twice that. Clifford committed his triple murder on the 9th of July 2024. But before he perpetrated those 3 killings, he already had murder in his family. In 2017, Bradley Clifford, Kyle Clifford's brother, who was then aged 23, punched as many as 9 times a young man who, having just been sent flying from the pillion seat of a motorbike, which had just been deliberately hit by a car, was lying on the road with catastrophic injuries. As he savagely pounded the youth with his fists, Bradley Clifford raged at the man that he deserved the beating. The attacker was subsequently sentenced to 23 years for murder, 18-year-old Sobhan Khan having later succumbed to his many serious injuries, his motorbike catastrophe, like his beating, having come from Bradley Clifford. To the perpetrator, you see, for breaking the wing mirror of his beloved red Ford Mustang, Mr. Khan had to die. That was his reason for ending the young man's life. You might be inclined to forgive the addiction to videos showing extreme violence that Kyle Clifford developed when he became a trooper in the Queen's Dragon Guards, his very willingness to lay down his life for his country being the reason for your said inclination for forgiveness. Entering into military service is what Kyle Clifford did shortly after his brother's incarceration, and you may be as surprised as I was to learn that having such a close connection to a murderer was no barrier to joining the army. Things may or may not have since changed. Likewise, given the man's willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice for his country, we may well choose to overlook the fact that none of his fellow soldiers liked him. Or we could discover the truth to the man's army career and understand what a sham it actually was.
You have been referred to at times as a former soldier. In many cases that would serve as significant mitigation. Not so in your case, however, as your 2 years in the army included 286 days at home claiming to be ill. You never saw active service, and your utility to the armed forces can be gleaned in a parting comment from your commanding officer that, quote, his character is wholly unsuited to military employment, and he has no care nor concern beyond himself.
In June 2024, after an 18-month relationship with Clifford, in which the man had quickly revealed himself as a bully, a racist, a misogynist and a serial cheat, Louise Hunt, a 25-year-old owner of a dog grooming business and daughter of BBC racing commentator John Hunt, dumped the man. This would have come as a huge relief to Louise's family, who had noticed very early on Clifford's controlling and unreasonable behaviour towards Louise, as well as his rudeness and his arrogance. While Louise and her family were aware from the off of the murder conviction of Clifford's brother, it never crossed their mind for a minute that, as a result of being dumped by Louise, Clifford would arm himself with a crossbow and a kitchen knife and then drive to the Hunt home in Bushey, southeast England, ensure that his ex-girlfriend's father was out because he would never have let Clifford in, and then trick Louise's mother into letting him in, enabling him to unalive her, her daughter Louise and her daughter Hannah, aged 28. This is precisely what unravelled on the afternoon of the 9th of July 2024, Clifford having told Louise's mother, Carol, when she answered the door to him, that he just wanted to return some of Louise's belongings and that he was grateful to have ever been accepted into their family. Seconds after Carol let him in, she was lying on the floor, dying from the many stab wounds that Clifford had inflicted on her with the kitchen knife that he had brought with him. Clifford's subsequent grape of Louise was his way of hurting and dominating her before unaliving her, which he did with his crossbow after keeping her tied up with duct tape for around 2 hours, just as her sister was approaching the house. In court, the judge observed that Louise would most probably have come to realise before she was unalived that Clifford had already unalived her mother, Louise having been working from a building out in the garden when that unaliving took place, and having been as such wholly oblivious to it. When, at around 6:54 p.m. that evening, Clifford left the house, Hannah Hunt, who Clifford had just fatally shot with his crossbow, was able to call the emergency services. On arriving, however, they found Hannah unconscious and were sadly unable to revive her. The following day, after a 22-hour manhunt, Clifford was located at a cemetery in the Lavender Gardens area of Enfield, North London. As officers approached the spot in the undergrowth where he was hiding, the man shot himself in the chest with his crossbow. This severed his vital spinal tendons, leaving him paralysed from the chest down. The aim of his act, though, was of course to end his life. However, as we can see, for all the perpetrator's skill at unaliving three defenceless and wholly innocent women with total savagery, when it came to unaliving himself, the fucker was totally f***ing inept. During his 10-week hospital stay, the man required a 24-hour police guard. While he lay in hospital, the only comments he made were "sorry" and "what I have done is atrocious." For all this apparent remorse, however, when he was finally fit to give an interview, he went no comment all the way through.
Do you accept, Kyle, that based on the evidence, that this is a premeditated murder of 3 people?
No comment.
Do you accept that you have meticulously planned this murder from the moment that you split up the bodies?
No comment.
From the moment that she sent you that text message at the end of June, you began to plan her murder? Yes?
No comment.
At the last minute, Clifford changed his plea from not guilty to guilty as charged. Normally, pleading guilty gets a defendant a shorter sentence than the one that they would have got if they'd gone to trial and been found guilty. Clifford got 3 whole life orders, the judge duly condemning the man as a savage, self-entitled dick.
The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. This is no occasion to subject the family and friends of your victims to any delay or suspense. I therefore make clear at once that for each of these 3 murders, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released.
His sentencing took place in March 2025. From being a family of 5, the Hunt family is now reduced to a father and a daughter only, there being, as you can see, a 3rd daughter. These are the words of the father, John, in his victim impact statement.
When I was first invited to provide a victim impact statement, I initially misunderstood its purpose. Do I really need to detail the impact of having 3/4 of my family murdered? He went on, whatever sentence you're about to receive, whatever misery lies ahead for you in the next 60 years, remember that after your days on earth are done, on your dying day there will be no release for you, Kyle. The screams of hell, Kyle, I can hear them faintly now. They're going to roll the red carpet out for you.
Kyle Clifford became a triple murderer just because he got dumped. David Newton, a 70-year-old former kitchen fitter from Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, was convicted on the 13th of February 2025 for the murder of 86-year-old Una Crown, the offence having occurred on January the 13th, 2013. Mrs Crown's body was discovered on January the 14th by relatives who had arrived to take her to Sunday lunch. They found the victim's body in the hallway of her Magazine Lane home. However, police officers initially treated the death of the former postmistress as unexplained. It wasn't until 2 days later, after a post-mortem examination, that the death was finally deemed suspicious. The post-mortem, you see, showed that Mrs Crown had been stabbed multiple times and that her throat had been slit. She had also suffered blunt force trauma. The attack had taken place the night before, the victim succumbing there and then. Now, how the f*** did the police and Mrs Crown's own relatives miss the stab wounds and the slit throat? Was the body not covered in blood? The body was also partially burned as the perpetrator had tried to set fire to it. Again, why did it take a post-mortem examination for that to be discovered? The knife that was used on Mrs Crown was an estimated 9.5 inches long. It was likely to have been Mrs Crown's very own kitchen knife. The blunt force trauma that Mrs Crown suffered, meanwhile, came from her own walking stick. Once the murder inquiry was launched, Newton, who had been working as an odd job man and who used to regularly walk past Mrs. Crown's home, was arrested but then released without charge. In 2023, however, thanks to advances in forensic technology, the evidence relating to the case was re-examined, and that led to the identification of Newton's DNA under Mrs. Crown's fingernails. Newton's conviction was secured after a 4-week trial at Cambridge Crown Court, where he was found guilty by a majority verdict of 10-2. Judge Mr. Justice Garnham said that Newton had a history of entering homes uninvited in search of company and conversation, and that Mrs. Crown must have been utterly terrified. In mitigation, defence barrister Henry Grunwald said Newton was a very different man to what he was back in 2013. Newton, you see, used to be known for his drinking, which often led to violent behaviour from him. Mr. Grunwald said that Newton wasn't a well man, the perpetrator being a sufferer of depression, diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, meaning, as the defence barrister observed, that the man could die in prison. Side note, f***ing good. End of side note. Describing Newton's attack on Mrs. Crown as ferocious and sustained, the judge basically told Mr. Grunwald to f*** off with his insulting mitigation. He asserted that Mrs. Crown, as I say, must have been utterly terrified, while also noting that Newton had entered Mrs. Crown's home, probably using a key that he had nicked basically, and attacked poor Mrs. Crown with a knife. Newton also nicked 80 quid from Mrs. Crown's purse after killing her. Newton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years, and yes, let him f***ing rot to death there. Being, as at the time of this recording, 81 years old, Richard Burrows probably got the longest sentence ever given to a PDF file in this country. The man's trial heard that the man had sorry, I'm disguising that word because of YouTube's decency policies, as many as 24 boys who were as young as 9 while he was a housemaster at a Cheshire boarding school and while he was a Scouts leader in the West Midlands between 1968 and 1995. The trial judge, Judge Stephen Everett, told Burrows at the sentencing hearing that took place on the 30th of April 2025, "You are a despicable man." When Burrows' defence barrister, Philip Climo, told the court that Burrows would spend his last days in prison, the judge said, "I don't suppose there'll be anyone who'll mourn that." In court, it was revealed that one of his victims said that he hated the abuse. That's very understandable, I'd say, and that it would happen as much as 2 to 3 times a week. He also said that he couldn't do anything about it because he was frightened and young. Judge Everett said that Burrows gave awful evidence in court, with in particular the claim that there were, quote, good PDF files and bad PDF files. The judge also remarks that Burrows had lied through his teeth in police interviews, and when Burrows nodded at him in response, the judge replied, "I see you nodding, it's too late now." Burrows was on the run for more than 27 years, fleeing to Thailand and changing his identity before returning to the UK in 2024 when he ran out of money. His defence barrister tried to use the fact that he'd come back to the UK of his own free will as a mitigating factor in his sentencing, but the judge said, guess what, if he hadn't run out of money, he'd still be in Thailand, still on the run, still doing everything in his power to escape justice.
Is your name Richard Burrows?
Sorry?
Is your name Richard Burrows?
Yes, it is.
Yes, my name is Detective Sergeant from Cheshire Police.
Sorry?
My name's I'm a Detective Sergeant from
Oh,
Cheshire
right,
Police.
okay.
Okay. I need to let you know that you're under arrest, okay, on for failing to appear at Chester Crown Court
Yes,
on
I
the
understand.
8th of December 1997.
Yes.
Okay. So you did.
One of Burrows' victims said that his childhood was completely and permanently destroyed by Burrows. This child was someone who Burrows once drugged and raped in a tent over a 12-hour period. There's another victim who's been in lots of TV interviews whose name is James Harvey, and he told the court that he was you-know-whatted by Burrows in a caravan at night. The attacks took place at an air show at Badgington Aerodrome, later known as Coventry Airport, after Mr Harvey had met Burrows while he was a Sea Scout in Walsall.
I suddenly was aware that this man was trying to touch me in a way that nobody had ever tried to touch me before. I didn't know what the end game would be, because I had no imagination and no understanding of what could happen. But I knew in that instant that this was not normal, this was terribly embarrassing and uncomfortable, and I didn't like it.
Some of the charges related to Burrows' time as a housemaster, as I've mentioned, and the school in question was Danesford School in Congleton, Cheshire. Judge Everett commented that, "I'm glad it's closed. One can only hope that places like that are never opened again," unquote, in reference, of course, to the school. He also observed that in that school, vulnerable boys were corralled into a place where staff either didn't care or actively SA'd little boys. Burrows was actually due to face trial in 1997, but he was bailed and he skipped bail and fled to Thailand. In Thailand, people liked him, he had lots of friends, he worked in local media, he worked with kids, and there was a restaurant that he always used to go to, always used to get fish and chips, and he did that for decades, and he used to recommend the restaurant to lots of people, help them get business. The man lived in, I don't know, some aluminium cabin. So when he says he came back because he ran out of money, I personally believe him. And the way he was discovered was that police a few years ago, in 2023 in fact, put his picture into a website that does facial recognition, and it linked him with the restaurant that he always used to go to and tell all his friends about. He had pictures showing him at that restaurant somewhere online, and that's how they traced him. I don't know how, even going back 27 years, he was able to get away with what he did, not with what he did rather, but with being on the run for as long as he did, because I think we had fairly sophisticated investigation and tracing technologies even then, because all he did to get away with being in Thailand for so long was to use a fake passport. He had a mate who was dying by the name of Peter Smith, so he just used Peter Smith's identity on his passport. That was all it took. And how long did he get? 46 years, longer than drug dealers, firearm dealers and murderers. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.